Tonight won't be a regular drash. I'm going to be talking about our recent trip last week, the week before this week, last week to Ukraine. But it is notable to me that this week's Parsha has, for me, one of the most haunting questions that God asks us as humanity. And some of you might remember some years ago I gave a Kol Nidre Drasha just about this pasuk, and it's on the front of the program. And it's the famous line where the Eternal calls out to the human and says to humanity, as I gave that drash back then, Ayeka, where are you? And in that drash, and what this pasuk has meant for me forever, is this question of God asking us, where are you? We often are told the question is, where's God when bad things happen? But I think often the question is really, where are we? Where is humanity? And this pasuk, and there's so much to say about it, really frames, I think, the discussion for tonight. Where are we? Where are you? And it's a very directive question. It's very, very personal. It is not in the third person. It's not vague. It's not theoretical. It's where are you? God is asking all of us. So a little framework and background. And by the way, after services, Randy and I will have a Q&A and a discussion for about half an hour for those who want to. We're going to do it in the sanctuary because it's the only way to do live stream and be able to reach all of you on at home. But for those who want to go downstairs and schmooze and eat downstairs, we're having a regular kiddush downstairs. For those who would like to stay and have another chance to ask questions and conversation, that's an opportunity also. We're going to pause for about 5 minutes after the service, and then we'll do that. So a little background. So Randy, as most of you know, is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, which is the largest union in the AFL-CIO. And as a teachers union, it not only embraces teachers, but has healthcare workers. It's the second largest nurses union in the country, for instance, and other kinds of paraprofessionals in school settings and other public employees. But the AFT has a very long history, I'm very proud to say, of being connected internationally and not only working on labor and union issues and public education issues, as important as that is, and let's just say, pretty important. Everybody see what DeSantis did this week? But that's not the talk for tonight. So Randy is very, very involved with teachers' unions all over the world. Anywhere we travel, we have meetings with teachers in any part of the world, whether it's Finland or Australia or Europe, South Africa, South America. Randy is deeply involved in all of those unions in an umbrella organization called Education International. And Randy's on the board of this organization, and as a result has deep personal connections. And in my years with Randy, I've met many of these teachers from all over the world. And in fact, the first time I went to Poland, breaking my lifelong commitment to never go to Poland, was when I went with Randy as part of the International Teachers Union to do a symposium in Krakow on the Holocaust in international public school education on this anniversary of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it was my first time in Poland, and it was my first time in Auschwitz, and it changed my life because I started to see things and my obligations as a rabbi differently about how to deal with the Holocaust, which is something I have studied at enormous detail ever since I was a teenager on all different levels, from high school classes to college classes to rabbinical school, and then my own studies. So all that's to say, this was the setting by which we were invited to go to Ukraine. The Ukrainian Teachers Union were people that we know and that Randy has known for many years, asked her to come and bear witness, to come there and see what's happening, and to not be forgotten. Randy went in 2014 for the Maidan Revolution, which was with the building that was blown up in Kyiv was the Teachers Union building. And she went then for a few days, and since then has really become very, very close with the teachers in Ukraine. So it was decided to do this quick trip, 4 days, and to go to Lviv. And to make this really clear and possible, so that's the framework. We were going to meet with teachers and to go to schools and see how schools were handling being in a war zone. And both by bringing supplies, and Randi's union has raised $100,000 to bring school supplies of all different kinds to Ukraine itself, as well as to the refugee Ukrainian children that are in Poland. And there's over 1 million in Poland who are refugee children. And they're scattered throughout the world as well. So in addition to bringing things, really I think the deepest and most important thing was watching the psychological impact. There are very few people from outside of Ukraine going into Ukraine right now. And these are, I hesitate to use this word but they're ordinary people. They're like us, right? We didn't meet with the rock stars of society or the famous politicians. We went with third grade teachers who are figuring out a way to teach in the middle of war. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So that's the bracket. That's how I want to start, with an introduction to what we were doing and why we were going. And I thought this was an extraordinary opportunity. Ukraine for Jews is a very complicated story. And it brings up, for anybody who knows anything about what happened in the Holocaust, or what happened before the Holocaust, or what happened since the Holocaust, it wasn't a good place to be Jewish. So what does this mean? So Ukraine, first of all, we're going to look at some maps. Jason, could we look at the first map? The first map, it's a little light. It's on page 8 of the, and again, it's a little small and a little light, so it's not going to be so easy to see, but it's in the program as well on page 8. This is the Pale of Settlement. What is the Pale of Settlement? In the 1700s, there was a Polish monarchy that was, and this is very complicated for those of you who have studied with me. I taught about this in the Yiddish class, and I'd love to teach this. I'm thinking of doing a whole Jews in Ukraine class. Again, I did one session in Shavuot, but forgive me if I do this in extreme, fast generalizations. In 1772, the Polish Empire was divided up by Russia, and before 1772, there were no Jews in Tsarist Russia. But in 1772, the borders were changed because of a lot of different complicated things. I'm not going into that now, trust me. There were 3 partitions of Poland starting in 1772 and going to the end of the 1790s. And those partitions chopped off the entire section of Eastern Europe in which there were the majority of the Jewish population of Eastern European identity. That means from the north, and if you can see in the map, and I know this is small, you'll look at home if you can. In the north is Lithuania, and in the south is Galicia. And so it went from north to south, including Poland, as you could see we'll see what becomes Poland. If you see, look for Lublin, that's obvious there. Lublin is Poland, that becomes part of the Pale of Settlement. Going all the way to the right, you can see all of that becomes part of the Pale of Settlement. That's where Jews lived in Tsarist Russia from 1772 to 1918, when World War I ended. But parts of that were absorbed, and I'm not going to, again, just accept this, okay? The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a piece of this, and parts of this became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Lviv, for instance, where we were, at this point, went from being Polish, Lvov, to being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and became known as Lemberg. And Lemberg was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The architecture to this day looks like Vilna. Coffee is coffee culture, cafe. It really feels like you're in Vienna, which I was not prepared for. And Lviv was not affected physically by World War II, so all of the buildings still remain. It's a spectacularly beautiful city. Okay, so let's look at the next slide of Ukraine. So this is what modern-day Ukraine is. Again, this map on your programs is on page 9. Now it starts to become clear. So after 1918, Very quickly, in 1922, the Soviet Union was formed after lots of civil wars and lots of murders of Jews, of course, and other people, but a lot of Jews got killed. 1922, the Soviet Union was formed, and it then took over the part that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and big chunks of what was Poland, and it was under Soviet rule, Stalin, Soviet rule until 1939. During that time, Ukraine was the focus of Stalin's murders in a way that I don't think most Americans have a clue. 1932 to 1933, Stalin funded the industrialization of the Soviet Union by starving 3 million Ukrainian peasants to death. It's called the Great Famine, and as a result, you can imagine Ukrainians hate Russians and the Soviet Union from a long time ago. 3 million people were starved to death. You have to understand that Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe. It is the most fertile farmland in all of Europe. And the way that Stalin funded the industrialization was by forcing the peasants to ship all of the wheat to Europe. He sold it to Europe and built his army, his factories, his automobile manufacturing. All of the manufacturing of the Soviet Union was built on the deaths of these 3 million, maybe more. That's considered a conservative number. 3 million Ukrainian peasants were starved to death. The horrific descriptions of what that is like, I'll spare you right now. The most important book to read about Ukraine is this book. If you're going to read one book, it's called Bloodlands by Tim Snyder, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. So in the 30s, Stalin decimates, murders, destroys. The intellectuals are sent to Siberia and to gulags, and there was a very specific effort to destroy the intellectual class of Ukraine because guess what? Those are the people who are going to fight back. 1939, the Soviet Union and the Nazi Germans come up with a pact where they divide up Eastern Europe. And 1939, the Germans say to the Soviets, you can keep Ukraine, and I'm simplifying, but in 1941, the Germans abrogate that treaty, and they take over all of Eastern Europe that they can. And so from 1930 and at 1941, all of this becomes Nazi-occupied. Okay, so in this map, to see where we were, if you either on the page or up, look, see where Poland is. Everybody see Poland? And you see Warsaw with the star in the upper left? Just, show me some life. Do you see that? Okay, thank you. You see that, okay? So Randy and I landed in Poland because it's almost impossible to fly into Ukraine, as you can imagine. You don't want to get shot down. So we flew into Warsaw, which you see where Warsaw is in the upper. So Warsaw is on the eastern part of Poland, of contemporary Poland. That's where my family is from. Kleinbaum is a very, very, very common name in the whole region of Warsaw. And then we drove for 5 hours to Lviv. Do you see Lviv? Everybody see Lviv? Show me some life, people, okay? So you could see, and you see where the border is. So Lviv is to the farthest west of Ukraine, close to the Polish border. Okay, that's the important part to understand, that Lviv is the farthest west, which means it is a major city, the farthest from Russia. Let's see the next map, Jason. This is the map which shows Ukraine, the red parts, and it's also on, this one is on page 8 of the program. The red parts are the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. So you can see the parts of Ukraine that are occupied are the eastern parts of Ukraine, which is the closest to Russia. And Crimea is that peninsula down below, which Russia has annexed at this point. And it's the bridge to Crimea that was blown up that Putin theoretically said he was punishing the Ukrainians for blowing up. So it's really important to see. While we were driving to Poland, that's when we started getting the alerts that Lviv, which had not had any bombs for 3 months, was starting to be attacked. And what was happening is that Russia was no longer just attacking the east, but was attacking every city and every major center where there are electric transformers. The attempt is to destroy the heat and electricity as winter approaches. It was totally clear. So as we approached the border, and we stopped in Zamość, and for me as a Jewish historian and somebody who loves Yiddish, to be in this region is so complicated because 35 to 50% of all of these cities were Jewish. 35 to 50%. Zamość is where Yud Lamed Peretz, my favorite Yiddish writer, was born and grew up until he moved to Warsaw, which was the great intellectual center, one of the great Yiddish intellectual centers. And so it was so thrilling for me. But it is completely Jew-free. There are no Jews. And there is a synagogue, which we found, which is all closed up, and they have signs on it. And this is a city that Zamość wasn't destroyed. So, Jason, let's start with the photographs, and we're going to use them. And I didn't have Harold on this trip. We did have a professional photographer. But these are all my pictures because I couldn't figure out how to download his. Turns out all this stuff takes a lot of skills I do not have. So this is the Warsaw Airport. I just love this because the name of the airport is the Chopin Airport. I mean, how fabulous is that? It is pretty incredible, the contrast between the culture. Did anybody see the movie The Pianist? If you haven't seen that, and he's playing Chopin, the pianist is playing Chopin as Warsaw is first bombed. So this is in Warsaw. Of course, wherever we go, we are deeply connected to the Jewish history of it. The ghetto was formed, and I could speak about this alone for a long time. But let's see the next slide. This is the famous bridge that connected. There were two ghettos for the Jews, the little ghetto and the big ghetto in Warsaw. Ultimately, they were combined. But the Nazis built a bridge that went over a regular street in which regular traffic happened, and it would be like going across 7th Avenue. And the Jews had to walk up and across that bridge to cross from the little ghetto to the big ghetto. And can you go back a slide, Jason? So today they've built this very moving monument on either side of the street. You see those two towers? They exist on either side of the street to mark where the bridge stood. It's very, very moving. It's beautiful. And there is a map and information. Next slide. So that's where the bridge was. And there is the marker of where the ghetto wall was. Warsaw was destroyed 85 to 90%. A year after the Jews had the Jewish uprising, the Poles had an uprising, and there was a massive Polish uprising against the Nazis. And then the Nazis completely bombed and obliterated Warsaw while the Russians were across the river within spitting districts. And the Russians sat there waiting until the Nazis had destroyed Warsaw until they went in. And so this is where the wall of the ghetto was, and this is at the base of one of those things where they have, next one, Jason? Keep going, thank you. And there's only one small piece left of the ghetto wall in all of Warsaw because the next year the Nazis demolished the ghetto when there was a Jewish uprising, and then the next year with the Polish uprising, the entire city was destroyed. So there's this one small piece of the wall that's left. The Jews themselves were forced to build the wall and to pay for it. It had to come out of Jewish money to build it. Next. This is where Janusz Korczak, whom I've also spoken about at great length, and those of us who have been on any trips to Israel, he was the great Polish educator. This is where his orphanage was in the Warsaw ghetto. And when the children were to be deported, he walked with the kids from this location to the Umschlagplatz, which is where 400,000 Jews from Warsaw were deported to Treblinka. And he was such a famous educator that the word is that that several of the Nazi soldiers said to him they would let him go because as children they read his children's books. He was a very, very famous writer, and he refused. He stayed with his kids. And this is the Umschlagplatz, which is very moving, which is the actual location of where the Warsaw Jews from July of 1942 to December of 1942, 400,000 Jews were deported, about 6,000 to 10,000 Jews a day on trains to Treblinka. Next. This is the Janusz Korczak, sorry, not in order. And this is also at the Umschlagplatz. I recited Tehillim as I do wherever. And also in Warsaw, I had just spoken about Emanuel Ringelblum, who created the Oneg Shabbos project, that he was a trained historian who, during the time of the ghetto, created a cadre of people, young and old, to record what was going on. We know very little of what went on in most of the ghettos in Europe, except for Warsaw Ghetto, because so much was written down. And this is a plaque for him. And he buried, on January of 1943, they buried 3 huge containers and multiple containers of the papers. And only 2 have been found to this day. And they were found by chance in 1952 when Polish construction workers, and during the Soviet times, were cleaning it up. Anyways, this is his, and that's one of the milk canisters. So for me, I've never been able to get into this Jewish Historical Institute. It was so deeply moving and a thrill to see it. Okay, this is Mila 18, the famous bunker in Warsaw from which the last resistance occurred, and all of the young people, the 24-year-old commander of the Jews, they all committed suicide in this bunker rather than be captured by the Nazis. This is the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, which was completely blown up by the Nazis. So let's keep going. And this is Zamość. Okay, stop here. So as we crossed the border into Ukraine, it took a while, like all border crossings, but it was relatively easy. And then we drove into the city of Lviv, but Russians had been bombing that day, and so all of the electricity was off, all electricity was down. So this is just, you could see what this is a famous part of Lviv, totally dark, just some electricity on generators. That's just showing where the border is, sorry. And this is the hotel, totally dark. So the next morning, the air alarms went off. And so we went down into the basement, into the shelters that were there in the basement of the hotel. But this is what's so moving. These are the Ukrainian teachers who had come, some of them from the Far East, from those red Russian-occupied regions. They so much wanted to meet with us that they came, and it didn't disturb them at all that we had to have the meetings in the shelter. And we just met with them in the bomb shelter. This is a colleague of Tim Snyder's, who is the author of this book, and you've heard me talk about Tim Snyder. He is one of the leading experts on the Holocaust in the world today. And as a result of his scholarship on the Holocaust is why I trust him on the opinion about what's happening in Ukraine today and what a sentient, decent human being's position should be. Hold on, go back to that one just a second. So she is a colleague, a PhD in Eastern European Jewish history, and she is now in Vienna doing scholarship on Ukraine and trying to collect materials about what's happening in the war. And she and Tim Snyder and other scholars have started something called the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, trying to teach real history and to actually try to have a level of depth. And I'll say this very quickly, but you've heard me talk about this in other times. After 1989, the scholarship about the Holocaust has completely changed. And those of us who studied the Holocaust before 1989, it's a different world than post-1989 scholarship. And people like Tim Snyder and Catherine Younger are examples of younger scholars who are studying the Holocaust and learning things that those of us who studied it in the 60s and 70s and 80s did not understand. And the world is really better for it. What happened in '89? The Soviet Union fell. For most of us as American Jews, we think the war ended in 1945. But if you lived behind the Iron Curtain, it was just another occupation by the Soviets as opposed to by the Nazis. And for Jews, the Soviet meant the concentration camps were closed and that Jews weren't killed in genocidal acts of terror, but whole populations were terrorized. And it created a source of a lot of tension in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and in Ukraine, that Jews saw initially the Soviet occupation as a good thing, and others saw the Soviet occupation as a terrible thing. And Jews were a little slower because for us it was liberation from Nazis. And Jews embraced communism in many of these countries, thinking that this was liberation from Nazism, and didn't realize what communism was going to end up doing to Jewish life, to Jewish culture, to Jewish memory. And in the years from 45 to 89, the Soviet communist regime was only concerned in wiping out Jewish culture, memory, and ideas, except a very, very, very narrow definition of what they considered acceptable. And of course, what we observe when we do the August 12th observance of the Night of the Murdered Poets was a culmination of that, so I'm going to pause on that. So even beginning to understand this is something that these new and younger scholars are trying to integrate and understand. Stalin and Hitler have to be studied together, not separately. And when we understand and study them together, it's very deep. It deepens our appreciation. Tim Snyder's argument is that with each of them could not have achieved what they achieved in their mass terror and genocide without the other, that they both fed and made it possible. So this is in the one of the things that Randy brought were tons and tons and tons of children's books that don't have words, that are all picture books, to be able to give the children there. So this is us giving them. We had these many suitcases full. Then the next day we drove down south, about an hour and a half south of Lviv, into the countryside, where there is a dormitory made out of a school building for internally displaced people. Millions of people are now, like in other places of the world, refugees. Some are internal refugees who have stayed inside of Ukraine, and some have left Ukraine. So this was a meeting that we had with teachers from all over, represented every single region. This one was where there are teachers from every single region, including those occupied regions. Hold on, go back to that. So this was a table, and we had earphones on, so when the Ukrainians spoke in Ukrainian, they would immediately translate, and when we spoke in English, obviously the reverse. And each one, it was 3 hours of just listening to them tell their stories. These are 3rd grade teachers, 8th grade teachers, kindergarten teachers, who are from these war zones describing what it's like. One of them told the story of their house where they went to their basement. Nobody has built shelters, right? You just go to the basement. And their entire house, their entire neighborhood was bombed. And so there was so much rubble on top of the house, she didn't think she was going to ever be able to dig her way out with her children. And she managed to. Anyway, so they were there. We went around the table. Each one told the story of how to have school. How do you teach? How do you take care of the children? What kind of trauma are these kids going through? And these are all for IDP, internally displaced people. People are staying inside of Ukraine. Millions and millions have left. Okay, next one. This is when we went south to this school building, which the teachers union had turned into a dormitory. And this is one of the teachers, and they were waiting outside for us. I mean, they were all lying. It was like they were so excited to see us. This is a traditional Ukrainian bread that's done at weddings and celebrations. And they were so, so excited to it tastes a lot like challah, very interesting. And she dressed in the traditional Ukrainian clothes. And we had different meetings with different teachers here. One woman in that slide before described when she was in one of these eastern regions that if the Russians heard anybody speaking Ukrainian, they would kill them. And so everybody speaks Russian and Ukrainian, but they saw it as a very important act to be able to teach their kids in Ukrainian. So they would speak in whispers to their kids, knowing just to make sure their kids had some spiritual strength. Many stories from all of these women. They were these are ordinary people. Look at this, right? These are the ordinary people who are living in times that demand extraordinary, and they're living up to it. Okay, this is the mayor of Lviv, who had a whole slideshow, because Lviv is the most, obviously the safest place. So you can see there are 500 shelters inside of Lviv for displaced people. That's a gym floor, if you could tell from the picture, just sleeping bags laid out on the floor. This is the city that's the most overrun with refugees inside of Ukraine. Next. Every piece of art, so this is the street of Lviv, is handled this way. We're outside, and what's the word of? No. What's it covering? Freezes. they're covering things in case there's bombing to make sure that, I mean, if a bomb hits those buildings, it's obviously destroyed, but if a bomb is nearby and just the reverberations, this is to protect, hopefully to protect the artwork from being destroyed, but also to protect people from being hit by stuff falling off. And you see it all over Lviv, every sculpture, and there's a lot of it. It's an old city with a lot of art. And then we did a tour of the Jewish quarter of Lviv. Again, 35% of Lvov when it was Poland, Lviv when it's Ukrainian was Jewish. And you see, and I kept thinking about our mezuzot here at CBST. This is what you would see in buildings. The medieval town of Lviv had 4 quarters, obviously, 4 quarters, and one of the quarters was the Jewish quarter. There was an Armenian quarter, a Jewish quarter, and we walked throughout the whole Jewish quarter. No Jews now, of course, but up until 1941, it was teeming with Jews, intellectuals. By the way, the lawyer who developed the concept of crimes against humanity, Lauterbach, and the lawyer who developed the concept of genocide, which were both used for the first time in the Nuremberg trials, are both Jewish lawyers from Lviv. The law school in Lviv apparently is a very famous law school with some very famous international legal minds from the 20s and 30s. And these 2 Jewish lawyers, Raphael Lemkin, developed the idea of genocide, which is destroying an entire people, and crimes against humanity, destroying individuals. So this is just shots of the Jewish quarter. We can keep going through this. See, it looks like more mezuzot. This is the Jew Street. The name actually means Jew Street, and where a synagogue used to be, and it's a very beautiful memorial there. And this is the Jewish ghetto in Lviv and the train station where Jews were executed. Ukraine is called the Holocaust by bullet because Einsatzgruppen, mostly the Jews of Ukraine, were killed not in concentration camps like the Jews of Warsaw were shipped to Treblinka, and most of the Jews in Ukraine were killed by shooting squads made up of Ukrainians and Nazis who would take the Jews into the forests around the towns and kill them. And in this case, thousands were killed by this bridge. This was the mouth of the ghetto, and then the ghetto was there from 41 to 43. And just more monuments to the ghetto and to the destruction of the Jewish community there. This is the monument to the... Just leave this up for a sec. So since I've spent a lot of time in Israel during intifadas, I know there are apps. So I looked, and indeed there is an app for alarms in English, which I still keep on my phone because I feel like I want to really know what's going on in Ukraine. And so everybody has an app on their phone. So when the alarm goes off, that's when you know to go to the shelter. So this is in the pretty blue and yellow, the English version, which was going off all the time. Okay. We then went back to Warsaw, and I'm wrapping up now, and I know it's late. And Randi was invited to speak at Teachers' Day, which is a day actually all through Poland. And the teachers' union is a very, very progressive union in a very right-wing country, which is swinging farther and farther and farther to the right. And the Minister of Education is very anti-gay, and Randi was asked to speak about LGBT stuff and kids in school. It was very moving, because these teachers are like here, on the forefront of democracy. They have an election next year, and if they lose that election, just like what we're facing here, the current president and prime minister have already kind of just completely destroyed the judiciary in Poland, and women's rights, LGBT rights, which had for a few years been going very well. And can you go back a second? So this is at this press conference and rally and demonstration. Keep going. This is this Ministry of Education, again, an amazing piece of Europe. This was the Gestapo headquarters when the Nazis were in Warsaw, and it's now the Department of Education, the Ministry of Education. It's really creepy, but that's what Europe is like, right? How do you live with all of these things? And, okay, next. Keep going. So this young man is the leader of the LGBT students group in Warsaw. And he's holding a sign that said a red card, and it's the name of the Minister of Education in Poland. Of course, I didn't know what a red card meant. So he had to, I know, that was embarrassing. So he had to explain. It was a sports thing. He said he didn't know it from sports either. It's just anyway, just that young man. Go back to that a second. So this young man is fighting for LGBT rights in schools all over Poland. It's a deeply Catholic country, and he understands what it means that it has this Nazi history and it has this now contemporary playing with fascism. And the next one. So this is a Ukrainian teacher who fled to Warsaw, and I posted about her because it was very moving. She couldn't speak any English, and we had interpreters. She had a class of 32 kids in Kharkiv, which is one of the cities in the Far East near Russia. 10 of her kids have stayed in Ukraine, 22 have left Ukraine, 1 is in Japan, a bunch are in Germany, and a bunch are scattered throughout Poland. And twice a week, she goes online and does a Zoom class with all 32 in all of their different time zones so that she can be in touch with them and check in on each of them, speak Ukrainian with them, and give them some, chizuk and strength. And it was so inspiring to me. And again, Zoom has that she's able to do this. And she said she stays in touch with each kid separately as well and knows how they're doing and tries to keep their sense of identity strong. So I think that's the last slide, and I just want to say a couple of things before we end this. It's really complicated. What do you mean as a Jew to go to Ukraine and then identify with Ukrainians? And I keep saying to people, well, what's the alternative? We act like Nazis too? Like we say because their grandparents or great-grandparents. And I look to people like Yelena Goltzman, our CBST member, who's from Kyiv, and now very, very active in the work as a Jew, had to leave in the 80s as part of the flight of Soviet Jews. And some of you have heard her talk about this. She couldn't be here tonight, unfortunately. The Azma category. She said when she left Ukraine in the 80s, she said, I never want to come back. I don't feel Ukrainian at all. It's not at all my identity. But then 2014 happened when there was this revolution and she started to see a progressive Ukraine emerging and progressive values which were dealing with the past and wanting to create a new future, to the point where you've seen now Yelena is the leader here in New York of the Russian-speaking world and the Ukrainian diaspora that's here. That's a remarkable thing for a Jew to be in that role. And I think it's an answer to Ayeka. The question is, and Rick, you're one that we've talked about this so many times, what exactly do we learn from the Holocaust? What is actually the message of the Holocaust? They treated us badly, so we want to see them suffer? Or do we figure out a way to model a completely different experience? I will say I am clear as ever that what's happening now in Ukraine is a harbinger of what could be. This is not going to be limited to Ukraine. And we have to see this for what this is, which is a really very serious threat to the whole world. As this part of the tsunami of fascism we're experiencing, this is happening in a deep way in the war. So I would say that we would ask everybody, and Randy would ask all the teachers, what do you want us to tell people when we go back? What's your message? And over and over and over they said, we want peace. We want our children to know peace. We're living in hell. Please help us in any way that you can. We want peace. Ayeka, where are you? Shabbat Shalom. Okay, hello, we're back to the online. Jason, do we have people? Sharon, do we have people online? So maybe every so often, if you want to interrupt Sharon and let us know if there's a question, you can share it so that we can get. So Randy's going to join me, and we're going to start by just opening it up and ask for responses. So this is masked only, folks, and this is mask optional, okay? Any responses, feedback, comments, questions? Let's open it up. I'm going to ask Jason, do we need to use a microphone for the live stream to hear, right? So I think Jason's going to get another, for right now, I'm going to repeat the question, but he's going to bring another microphone so we're not. Okay, hand up. Was that you, Liz? No. Suzanne. Behind Liz. I knew I saw a hand over in this area. A lesbian lawyer hand.
We're all sort of fungible.
Yeah.
So I mean, the comment is thank you. Thank you for everything.
Yeah, we do. Thank you.
I'll be Oprah for those old people. Phil Donnie.
Is it on?
He has to get back up there. Poor Jason, he has to do everything, so he's... Yeah, she's gonna, he's gonna turn it on.
Yeah, I'm just, okay. Good. So the comment is thank you. Thank you for the sharing. Thank you for the maps. Thank you for the reading material and the links and everything else. And then a bigger thank you to both of you for going. And I know you've talked a lot, and you've taught me a lot about bearing witness, and I do admit I borrow that sometimes, and I don't always credit you for it. But
I borrowed it from somebody else,
yeah,
so it's okay.
But truly, I think that the two of you bearing witness enables all of us to bear witness, and so thank you. So I have two questions. One is, like, for example, the third grade teachers you were talking to, like, are they teaching academics, and how's that going for them? And then a broader question, which is for both of you, in addition to people saying they wanted peace, did they talk about hope for the future? Are they pessimistic, optimistic, somewhere in the middle? And if you could just share a little bit about what they are imagining their future will hold.
And if you want to also, if Randy, if you want to say anything, as a little introduction to what your experience was, and then talk about that, that'd be great.
So, I haven't been in too many places. I mean, we tease a lot about being in Israel when there's bombs, but there's an Iron Dome. So there's normally, I've spent some time with people who have been through intense atrocity, but normally I spend time with them when they're out of it, not when they're still in it. And so what I found remarkable is the resilience and the sense that they are going to win this war against Russia, and they are going to have, that this is the kind of way they spoke. Of course, in a language I couldn't understand, but that tone of they're going to win, they're going to do everything they can to win, and they're going to have a free Ukraine. And the word I kept thinking about that was a through line for me was they really saw themselves, the teachers, as nation builders. But the complexity is there. It's not, they're under martial law. There is a very bad labor law right now that they're fighting that may acquire and take over some of the buildings that the unions have. So it's not as if it's sweetness in life in any way, form, or manner. The parliament is very conservative. Zelensky's government is very conservative. But they are really trying to both connect, like the teacher that Sharon was talking about in Poland, but also really teach basic fundamental principles. And we heard a lot about how Russia in the occupied areas, or the areas as they called that were de-occupied, how they immediately tried to change textbooks to make them Russian-centric and get rid of all the Ukrainian. I mean, the atrocities we heard about were many, including how the Russians took, Ukrainians very much focus on education, and it is a very technologically savvy country. But so everybody has everything. But the Russians are very much attempting to just eviscerate any kind of Ukrainian history.
The question about hope, this is what I have found about human beings in general. The ones who are engaged in fighting are very hopeful and full of resilience. The ones who are sitting back and complaining are the ones who are depressed and full of despair. It's true also in Israel, for instance, in Palestinian and Israeli conflict issues. The people inside the conflict who are really trying to make things better are very inspiring people. The kvetchers are the people who are, like us, who are sitting on the outside feeling full of despair. There's nothing that fights despair more than engaging in trying to make something better. And that's what they're all engaged in right now. So, they're very, and as Randy said, the current political situation in Ukraine is very complicated. Ukraine is a country that had terrible corruption before. And if you watch Zelensky's show, which is on Netflix, that made him famous, it's all about their fighting corruption. And it's by the way, it is on Netflix, the first season of his show, which made him a national figure in Ukraine. And as Randy said, Zelensky didn't know anything about forming a government, and the person he made Secretary of Labor is anti-union. So within the country, so you have to both kind of fight the issues that we're all familiar with. Governments are not perfect, and Zelensky's government is not a perfect government, and far from it. He didn't know anything about being in political life, and basically, as somebody said to us, he said, "Who wants to be on my team?" Basically, and he put everybody in his government who wanted to be in his team, and that included a lot of right-wing libertarians, and they want to see a Ukraine. And now there's a fight within Ukraine for what the future of Ukraine will be when it's free. And the people we met with, teachers, are obviously on this one side of that, but they're very much engaged, very, full of despair about what the fighting is doing, and the death is very clear and obvious, and the atrocities are horrific, and everybody knows somebody who's in the army, who's dead, who's been in that eastern region, that whole red area. And by the way, the program also has a bunch of resources and things as well. Everybody knows people, even if they're from Lviv and have never been to the east. And Lviv is now full of refugees. So I would say people were very, very hopeful. And they can't lose. It's like they're in a position of the Russian soldiers are not interested in being there, but the Ukrainian soldiers, and that motivation is pretty strong. But it really depends on America and EU, let's face it. That's ultimately. And they were teasing about how every elderly grandma now knows missile systems. Yeah, everybody knows.
Everybody knows the drones, everybody knows missile systems,
yeah.
And everyone said to us, get America to give us more missile systems.
There's no question there. Noemi? Yeah. Continuing the lesbian lawyer section here.
In the context of tonight, when they looked at you, did they ask, where are you? What can we, the world outside of Ukraine, do for them?
Well, so for me, part of the ayeka to me was that I feel like I need to teach about this. Part of it is I realized how little I understood the map before I went. I know the map of the Pale of Settlement very well. I don't really know the map of contemporary Ukraine. And part of what I feel like the ayeka for me, I'm a rabbi of a synagogue that has a lot of people, so one thing I can do is I can teach about it so more people understand. And tonight was like a superficial beginning. There's a lot more to learn and to understand. And if anybody is inclined, Tim Snyder's class, which I'm listening to now, is brilliant. As I said, he's a professor at Yale. And right now, he's teaching a whole class on the history of Ukraine. And we're just up to the Habsburgs, and we're at lecture 12. And they've made them free. They've gotten 2 million views. Wow. It's pretty amazing. And it's the best part of going to college, right? The lectures without the papers or the exams. It's fantastic. So the first thing is I would say to people, ayeka, the first thing is to learn. To really become educated. Americans are notoriously ignorant about the world, geography, geopolitical stuff. Be educated. See this as part of one way to be a witness, and thank you, Suzanne, for saying that, because that is essential to who I am. Is like the first thing is don't turn away, right? The first thing is to be open to learning new things. Also about the Holocaust. We can't just pretend this is a Ukraine that doesn't have all that history. That history is a part of who Ukraine is. But the part I was trying to get to, and I think was the most moving for me, and I consider myself an amateur Jewish historian, so I never really considered how much the Ukrainians have suffered. I only know the story of how Jewish, my people, suffered in that region. I never really have studied how the Ukrainians suffered. Does it make it okay? No, of course not. But it means the story gets more and more complex. I've only heard about the pogroms against Jews. Anybody here learn about the famine that killed 3 million Ukrainians in a year and a half? So that's about,
Really good history teacher.
What?
I had a really good history teacher.
You had a good history. That was about 10 people in this room have ever heard about it. For Ukrainians, that's at the center of their lives. We met one young woman who was one of our interpreters. 9 people in her family starved to death. She's very young now, but it's in her family. So anyway, let's go to more questions. Yes, Joel?
Wait, Joel,
Joel, you have to wait for the mic so folks online can hear. Hello, everybody online. Do we have people online watching, Sharon?
No, this is about 35 years ago. I was passing by a Ukrainian bookstore, and they had a book there speaking about this topic. It said, why is one Holocaust worse than the other? And they said the whole, I can't pronounce it, like they call their Holocaust like a holodomor or something like that.
But it's not popular to use that word anymore.
Oh, it isn't? Okay. But this was at the time.
Yep.
And they said that, they claimed there were 6 million, and they were saying why was theirs ignored while the Jewish one was, like this was in Toronto, and there's a very, very large Ukrainian population. There was some conflict.
And part of what happened is that because it was the Soviet regime, there was a total censorship. And there's a fantastic movie on Hulu right now that I just started watching because somebody told me about this week called Mr. Jones, which is on Hulu, which is about a journalist who got into the Soviet Union. Because, of course, the Iron Curtain meant there was total censorship. Information was not flowing about what was happening in 32 and 33. There was a depression everywhere, right? So everybody was going hungry all over the world. And he got in and tried to get the story out. The movie on Hulu is called Mr. Jones. It was made in 2020. And it's all about this famine and the kind of the West's, first of all, the West was very involved in the depressions that were going on in Europe and in America. I'd have to say the left did not want to believe that the Soviet Union was doing something this bad. Remember, in the 30s, communism was a popular thing on the left, right? In America, the communists were anti-racist. They were doing work that nobody else was doing. And look, I grew up in the 60s. In the 60s, we believed that all the anti-Soviet stuff, anti-communist stuff was just right-wing propaganda. And that's 30 years, how many years, I'm bad at math. That's many years after this particular famine. So it's like, I think the left didn't want to know the bad things the Soviet Union was doing. And the Soviet Union had intense censorship. So there is a way that there was a silence about it that progressives who would normally care about the fact that a government is starving its people to death look the other way. I do think that we on the left have some tshuva to do. But not just for that, by the way. But go ahead, yes.
Just to add to what you were saying about people on the left here supporting communism. I understand that a lot of Jews, a lot of Yiddish speakers, or people involved in the Yiddish-speaking world were very left-leaning, and some of them were communist and Soviet sympathizers.
Absolutely.
But then you had a time when Jews were trying to escape the Soviet Union. So when did things change? I know there was a time when there was a lot of denial about Stalin too. So what was it in the 50s, the 60s?
Right. So that's a fantastic question. So first of all, if we imagine before the Russian Revolution, there were the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, right? The two big parties that supported revolution against the Tsarist Russia. there were a lot more Jews in the Menshevik Party than the Bolshevik Party, but there were Jews in the Bolshevik Party. The Mensheviks lost. So Jews didn't do so well in that particular fight. The Bolsheviks win. This is also super superficial. I would love to teach this stuff. This is my my amateur passion. So after the Bolsheviks win the civil war in Russia, and the Soviet Union is then established in 1922, it took those years of, and again, the Jews got killed. I mean, the pogroms against Jews from 1918 to 1922, massive, horrible. Once again, it's bad for the Jews. But then there were a lot of Jews who were very sympathetic to the Bolshevik revolution, to then the Communist Party. Many Jews were active in the Communist Party and were anti-religion. So the Soviet regime of the 1920s, its language, or what do you say? Kind of its what's that phrase? The way it described it was that Jews who were not religious and only spoke Yiddish were okay. Judaism, which was any religion was not okay because they were against all religion. So they said if you were Yiddish-speaking, anti-religion, you could live in the Soviet Union, and many Soviet Jews embraced that. Many did not, but many did, and there were no question that there was Jewish leadership in the Soviet Communist Party in the 20s and 30s. Lenin dies, Stalin takes over. Stalin is really an anti-Semite, but he continues these policies on paper, which is if you're Yiddish-speaking, not Hebrew-speaking, and you're not religious, you're okay. But Hebrew was declared a bourgeois language and made illegal, and Yiddish was the language of the proletariat, so it was okay. And I think some of you might have heard, I've even talked about that the Hebrew words that are spelled, the orthography of Hebrew words in Yiddish are spelled according to the Hebrew orthography, and all other words in Yiddish are spelled phonetically. So if the word is Slavic or Germanic in origin, it's spelled phonetically in Yiddish, but if it's Hebrew, it's spelled according to the Hebrew word. So the word like Sefer, it's a book, is spelled not phonetically, it's spelled according to its Hebrew spelling. In a Yiddish book, the word Sefer has to be spelled phonetically by law I think that law was passed in the late 20s. So for those of you who are Hebrew readers, so it would be Samech, Ayin, which is an S sound in Yiddish, Sefer, Pei, Ayin, Resh, Sefer. So the Ayin would be inserted as the vowel. So Noemi, look at that. Now you understand what I'm talking about, huh? See, all that Hebrew at CBST is a good thing. Anyway, so that is how crazy it went. No Russian communist knew that about Yiddish. Who knew that even? It had to be Jews right? It's like they didn't know how the orthography of Yiddish. So it was Jews who instituted all of that. Then zoom up to World War II. Jews are seen, so in communist Russia under Stalin, Jews are very badly treated, but some of them are still part of the communist elite. World War II comes around, all of a sudden the Nazis are bad, we need the Jews to tell the world and to organize anti-Nazis, and they form the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in 1940. And that becomes, now we're all fighting the Nazis, we're not just killing the Jews. So the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee exists all of the war, and Jews are no longer targeted. 45 comes around, Nazis are defeated, Jews start to be targeted again. Stalin dies in 52 or 53, I don't remember what year. What? 53. So until Stalin dies, it's terrible for Jews. And then even after, and I mean as in executions, and sent to gulags. But in the 30s, a Jewish colony was created called Birobidzhan, which was way the hell out there, on the, towards Central Asian countries, which was going to be the Yiddish-speaking Jewish homeland, because the communists had this idea that everybody had and Jews were shipped out there. And there was Yiddish culture, camps, newspapers, schools, theater. But guess what? Jews didn't want to live in Birobidzhan, but some did move there. The real communists did move there. And I have a book that was actually published in the publishing house in Birobidzhan. So then the 50s and 60s, Jews are very badly, after Stalin dies, the Jews are very badly treated in quotas, social discrimination, not being executed. The execution stuff, pretty much stops when Stalin dies. But Jews still can't go to universities. They still can't, different professions are pretty much forbidden. And there are quotas in all different kinds of ways. And that goes on from the 50s and the 60s, the 70s. And then in the late 60s is when the movement to free Soviet Jews starts happening, in the mid to late 60s, starts picking up steam in the 70s. And my father was very, very involved in that, and I was very involved as a kid in that. And it turns out David Wein, we're sitting in his sanctuary, his father was a really big person in the Free Soviet Jewry movement and knew my father. So David and I always joke that we've recreated. My father was the Jewish professional, and David Wein's father was the lay leader, and now I'm the Jewish professional, and David's the lay leader. So we like that. But the Free Soviet Jewry movement then had an incredible impact, and Frank Lautenberg, the senator from New Jersey, right? He's from New Jersey, wrote of one of the most important bills that made Soviet Jews be able to be expedited and leave. And the Soviet Union was starting to loosen its grip, and there were two huge waves of allowing Soviet Jews to leave. But if you talk to any of them, many are CBST members now, it was very rough. They had to leave behind everything, all their material, tremendous discrimination. And most of them left because their children would have no future in the Soviet Union of that time. They weren't really afraid of executions, but there were no economic opportunities, and they couldn't go to high-level academic institutions. And if they wanted their kids to be able to go to college and to have a profession, they needed to leave. So that was in the first huge wave was in the 80s, and then there was another huge wave. And so there's a lot to say about that. But that's a very brief history of Jews in the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union fell apart in 1989. Is that okay? How'd that do?
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. But I was actually asking more about. Sorry, I should have rephrased what I was saying.
Oops.
No. That was really
use the
great.
mic just so everybody can.
Sure. I meant to ask more about the Jewish intellectuals here, and I should have.
You mean here in America?
I should have specified it. I'm sorry. I meant the Yiddish-speaking community here, the Jewish intellectuals. A lot of them here were just like their Soviet counterparts, were fairly left-wing. They had socialist or communist inclinations. Some of them, I was just reading something about how most of them at a certain period of time gave up on idealizing Stalin, even though some. But when did things here change?
Well,
in terms of that
that's a more complicated question, because that's like in general, how did communism? So with Khrushchev in what was that year? 56? Was that the big year of what? Yeah. 1956 was the big speech. Where he took responsibility for some of the evils of communism. That was a big change. And then a lot of those early communists, from City College became the neocons, the Jewish neocons. They were so disillusioned. This is a whole other story about they were so disillusioned when they realized what the Soviet Union was actually, that they became the neocons that formed Jewish, which we now have in the world of Jewish conservative. A lot of the early Jewish neocons had been communist sympathizers or even in the party. And they were so disillusioned, they kind of went, whoop. Yeah, so let's have another question.
It's a complicated economic question, too, in the labor movement and all sorts of other movements.
Yeah. Sorry, yes.
First of all, thank you both so much for going and coming back and being able to tell all of us your stories and what you saw and thinking about your trip. I mean, this is brave on a whole different level of what I think most of us do in our day-to-day life. And I would love to hear how you make the decision to go, how you balance fear with, I'm going to fly into a war zone and go sit with third grade teachers and come back and be able to tell our community about it and make a difference. What does that look like for you in this instance and in your day-to-day activism?
Well, I asked Sharon to come. And think about it, then we got to spend a few days together.
Yeah, going to a war zone means.
No, but seriously, I thought So, it doesn't. Monday was a tough day because trying to think about not us, but the responsibility we had with others and what that meant and what that looked like. And that was honestly, that was a very tough day. I think that both of us, or I'll speak for myself, we had security with us.
The security said they didn't think there was a problem going to Lviv.
Yeah,
Then
initially.
the bomb started, so whatever.
And then they said, we can mitigate the danger. So, you're constantly balancing, is this worth it? Are you a burden to the people who you're visiting? That was much more the question than our own personal safety. I have a view in life that when it's time, it's time. And it's just a matter of, were we a burden? And what about everybody else who was with us? And we spent a lot of time in Samosh. We actually went back to the same restaurant that we processed in Samosh on the way back, because I needed to make sure that everybody was really okay going. And we had 2 cars, so if people weren't, they could go back. And it was, but I think there was only one moment when we were there. There were 2 moments. One, when we drove in and everything was dark in this city. Everything was dark.
And the road driving up to the city, everything was dark. It was just the whole, it was...
So that was a moment of just thinking about that. And then there was a second moment where we had gotten some notice, and some of it was just a failure to communicate effectively. But we were sitting in the bar, and we were on Monday night, because, when all else fails, just drink. I'm teasing. But it was, and one of our security folks says, well, in 45 minutes, the bombs are going to start. But that's not what he meant. He meant the bomb alarms. They had gotten some chatter about the alarms. And I think that was the only moment.
They hadn't gotten chatter. I called an Israeli friend of mine who's in Israeli intelligence to ask them to evaluate the intelligence, because I didn't trust this guy. And she said, oh, don't worry.
So I would say that was the only moment that I thought, maybe this wasn't a good idea. But the last thing I'd say is, but it got balanced by, on Tuesday, when we walked into we did this big meeting with at the university, and they opened the university for this, and the university president came in, and you saw it was like a United Nations table, a Security Council table, and there were literally 100 people around that table, or around the second circumference of the table. And that night, the Ukrainian teachers, they hung out all night together. We did not. They were dancing, they were singing. The fact that it became
It was the
a
first time
convening.
they had been together since February 24th, when Russia invaded.
So
They've all been isolated. So our coming there brought that, they all came to be with us. So they came from all over the country. It was very, very, very moving. I'm not sure it's possible to even express.
And so they kept saying to us Tuesday and Wednesday, because we all kind of had dinners together in that same restaurant in the union headquarters. They kept on saying how important our trip was, that it was a psychological boost to them. And people had come from occupied areas. They had driven from occupied areas to get there.
While this bombing is going on, I mean, think about this. This is that last week when there was bombing, and they just wanted to be with us so much. How could we feel scared? It felt a little weird. Like I don't know. I agree with Randy. I'm very much. if it's my time, it's my time. And I don't want to take undue risk, but it felt like the benefit so outweighed the risk. Once we were convinced that it wasn't going to be a burden, but the invitation came from them. Do you know what I mean? So that Randy kept saying, I kept saying to Randy, make sure they understand we're not coming if it's at all a burden. Because in difficult war zones, it could be, and they kept saying, and the feedback we got from people, it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming. Kim.
Wait, Kim.
Well, you need the mic just so that, yeah.
Randy, I have a question for you. I have to tell you, when I was looking at the photographs of you meeting with the teachers, I mean, it was so moving, obviously, but my heart was sinking in a way. And I was imagining for them to see you, Americans, leaders, religious leaders, labor leaders, so forth, coming to them be so, so important and so strengthening and everything else. But I'm also wondering if they express to you fears about what is happening in this country in terms of looking at the United States as a source of hope and a beacon of strength and support. But we don't know what's going to happen. And we now have Republicans who are saying that if the Republicans retake the House, they're going to say that's it for support for Ukraine and we're done. And I'm just wondering if you heard that kind of fear and anxiety about how reliable actually is the U.S. for us.
Look, I think there's it's much too primal right now in terms of so many of the rank and file folk. They are feel for. I mean, I did tease earlier about how so many people now know all the missile systems, and so they know America is really important to them and important in terms of their freedom. It would have been interesting to be there after McCarthy's statement about moving away from Ukraine. But,
I feel like we had to explain it to them a little bit. I don't think they totally got in some occasions, some
Right.
conversations, there were different kinds of people we met with. But in some conversations, they kept thanking us for what America's doing, and we kept having to say to them, listen, if the Democrats lose, it's going to be bad. And some of them were not totally aware of that.
yeah, I would
Some
say
were, not every, but some were shocked to hear that it's as...
there's a sophistication amongst the labor leadership and the intelligence. There's a sophistication amongst some groups of folks, but there's also not a lot of American news that comes in, even in terms of Lvov. What you get, the two channels that you get that are English are BBC and the Euro channel. So there's not a lot of play. They don't know a lot of what's going on here.
And a lot there don't speak English the way you would find in some other European countries where, all the young people and, in some countries speak English and there's much more accessible. I mean, there's just not that, it's not quite like that. But I was shocked because people were very, very moved at what America's doing. They love Biden. I kept saying, listen, we said in several occasions, we are under attack right now, and if on November 8th we lose the House and the Senate, there's no money going to Ukraine. The Congress is in charge of allocating money, and it's not going to go well if that's.
There is a love
Randy, we're gonna,
for America.
Oh, Sharon, and are there questions you want to pass to us from the online?
Yes, I have two questions, but first, as an educator, I want to thank you and Randy very much for what you did last week and for what you always do. As I looked at the slides, all I could think was, this is what teachers do. We do this here, we do this everywhere around the world, so thank you from my heart. I have a question from Jorge, our good friend Jorge. He says he would like to ask Rabbi Kleinbaum what it is for her to return to Poland and face Holocaust memory, especially in these challenging circumstances, and what did you discover or learn this time that you hadn't considered before?
So as I said, I feel like going to Europe is really important in a way that I never really got before that. And as I said, I had a thing of never going to Poland, never going to Germany, having this I grew up with very much the thing. And now I feel it's part of my life's work to go to bring as many people as I can. There is nothing like actually being there, both in terms of the incredible rich history that Jews have from that region, and you can't appreciate it also without knowing it, and also with the atrocities I feel like it serves my need to witness. If there's nothing else I can do, witnessing and not turning away and learning the details of what happened is really important to me. And it continues to feed my commitment to my vision of social justice. It doesn't undermine that, but I think we're losing that. People aren't as interested in it, or the word Holocaust makes people glaze over. That's ridiculous. We have to continue to study it, to learn it, to be present, to recite Tehillim El Malays, to really be present for that. I really believe that. I think the piece of history that I'm learning more and more now, having read this book by Tim Snyder, which I mentioned and now really do, is to really appreciate that for Americans, the war ended in 1945. That is not true for anybody who lived behind the Iron Curtain. And we think about Jewish life as being freed as of 1945. If you were a Jew in Poland or in Russia or Czechoslovakia from 1945 to 1989, you were completely separated from Jewish life. There was no Jewish life, and you couldn't actively pursue Jewish life. And a Jewish identity was a source of danger. That was from 45 to 89. And we in America, I think, do not appreciate that. We think the war was over in 1945 and Jews were free. That's just not true. And you don't really understand or appreciate that until you're there in a way. I feel, for me, I don't mean you, I didn't really deeply understand and appreciate that. And so to be in yet another place like Ukraine, which was, I've been to Poland, not as much as I'd like, I want to do more, but to really see the suffering that continued from 1945 to 1989. I had a very moving talk. We had a couple of these young interpreters who are the English speakers. They've studied English. This is going to be their career. Very, very moving, very highly educated people. And they talk about the fear culture that existed in Ukraine from 1945 to 1989. Just the anxiety and fear. And this one young man said to us in the apartment building that they lived, they knew that 20% of the people in the building were paid informants for the Secret Service. That you just knew, and people were children were informing on parents, children were informing on teachers. We can't imagine that. And we think the Nazis when we got rid of the Nazis, Europe was liberated. It's just not true, and we are not, Americans, I do not think, and progressive Americans really appreciate the suffering that happened from 45 to 89, and that those countries were not prepared for democracy or openness, or they were so crushed for so many years of just a fear culture. And people were imprisoned constantly. And so I think that's a piece that I'm expanding in my thinking. Another question, Sharon?
Yes, this question's from Nolan Hill. I'd like to ask the rabbi what she thinks about the links between the timing of the war and our midterm elections.
The timing of the war and our midterm elections, I guess.
Yes, that's what she said.
I don't know. That's a good question.
I think
I don't know.
thought he was going to win in 3 days.
Yeah, I agree with Randy. I think that
I
the Russians thought it was going to be over quickly.
Yeah, but I do think the Russians. This access of OPEC and Iran and the Russians right now, and the issue around the oil. That was time for the election.
Lewis.
I'm asking you this in your role as a rabbi. You said earlier this evening how God said to us as human beings, where are you? With everything going on in Ukraine, have the Ukrainians said, where is God? Where is he with all this hate that went on from the Holocaust. Now, things that might be hate here, I know of people who were...
Okay, Louis, we have to have quick questions just because we're coming to our time.
Have people lost their faith in God?
It's an important question. Have I lost my faith in God? And my answer to that question is no, I haven't, because my faith isn't based on God acting like a puppet in the universe. I don't see God acting in that way. I feel like we have choices. Human beings can either act godly or not act godly. And we have choices about how we bring God into the universe. And human beings fail a lot. But what we don't notice is that like these teachers who are doing this incredible stuff in the face of that, I want to focus on that. Oh yeah, I know. It's very hard. There's a lot of evil in the world, no question. Okay, another lesbian lawyer has her hand up.
The question is, can you really tell the difference among us, right? Exactly. But that actually, in some ways, is a perfect lead into my question. Which, okay, sorry.
So you can keep the mask
No,
on.
it's
You
okay.
just have to have the...
It's a perfect lead into my question in a lot of ways, which is, Randy, obviously you're out. People know. But what is it like to be openly gay in this context where obviously gay is not the major thing on people's minds these days, but, you know, it's not for nothing. So I'm just wondering if there is anything about that you guys were dealing with there.
It's a very traditional society. The Catholic Church is very big, not just the East, which that was interesting for me too. That's a whole other issue, is Christianity in Ukraine was more complicated than I thought. I had very simplistic ideas about it being the Eastern, there's a very big Armenian church there from history. So that I love that. We went to an amazing Armenian church that is from 1300s. I mean, Lviv is an old city, so I love that stuff. But we were totally out together. I mean, we were introduced ourselves as being together. So I think we did our job of kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. We didn't make it the point of our discussions with people, but it was totally obvious that we were together, and Randy introduced me as her wife to anybody that we were meeting. So I think probably it freaked some people out, but it didn't freak everybody out. And in Poland, Poland is really right-wing, and this is a very big issue. I think in Ukraine, this is not a huge top-of-the-line issue right now, because they're in a survival mode.
Although they do in Ukraine. I mean, it's very traditional. And you could see some body language when I introduced Sharon as a rabbi and my partner.
Right.
And wife sometimes. I use wife sometimes, I use partner sometimes. But in the Ukrainian army, there is a gay brigade where they are wearing a rainbow flag with the Ukrainian flag. Yeah. And people
there's a way actually to contribute to that.
Yes, yeah. I mean but in Poland, one of the things they specifically wanted me to talk about on Teacher Day, which is part of the reason the trip was aligned at the time it was. And we are, I mean, Sharon explained it in her drash, but we are very close to the Polish Teachers Union. It is the largest teachers union in Europe, and there's just we have a very long-term
Randy could give an
relationship.
amazing talk about the international world of teachers' unions. It's such a fascinating, that's a whole other topic. But.
So they really wanted me to be there and talk about in their education. They had a week of protest, and they wanted me to talk about LGBTQ issues. And what was interesting is that all of a sudden the former prime minister came at the same exact time, but they still worked it out. So there were, as you saw from the pictures, the leader of the teachers who is fighting the LGBT issues. He and several others were there on the panel with me, and it was freaking courageous of them because their pictures
It's
are
easy for
all
us, you know, we're not-
across the, I mean, the fact that they were all out there and the teachers union wanted me as a lesbian to be out there talking about it.
And afterwards, the head of the teachers union was he Ted in Warsaw or all of Poland? Slavomir. So he's the head of the teachers union of all of Poland. We sat with him afterwards, and he said, "I'm so glad you did this. We're really pushing on the LGBT stuff in Poland now, but the Catholic Church, especially outside of Warsaw and outside of the big cities, it's really dominant, and the right-wing government is really anti-abortion and anti-gay. I mean, that's there, and they've really totally changed. For a while, Poland was opening up and doing some very progressive things. It's now like Hungary. Poland is now very, very similar to Hungary. Yes. And we'll just do a couple more minutes. Thank you all. You're indulgent.
I'm Barry Rand. I'm a new member.
You have to leave your mask on. You're in the mask section, so you can't take your mask off. Sorry, yeah. No. If you're sitting there, you've got to wear your mask. If you want to move over there, you can take your mask off. Okay, just hold it up to the...
Okay, so my question is, so first of all, I'm not a lesbian lawyer. I'm not a cantor.
You're a what?
I'm not a cantor.
You're not a cantor or a lesbian lawyer. Okay, that eliminates 90%.
But I'm interested in your experience there in terms of your feelings about Ukrainians. Because I'm of a certain generation post-war that felt that the Ukrainians were collaborators, at least a certain group of Ukrainians, like a certain group of Hungarians, were collaborators with the Nazis.
Absolutely.
And I'm also...
Polish too, but...
Yeah. Post-war, I was in Kiev when it was called Kiev, and it was part of the Soviet Union in 1985. I went to Babi Yar, not a word about Jews. And of course, they considered it a province of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. So let me answer to that, and we're going to just take one or two more. Thank you so much. So first of all, what you talk about Babi Yar is exactly what I'm talking about the Soviet Union. For the time from 45 to 89, Babi Yar was not acknowledged as a mass execution site of Jews, but just of people. And that is an expression of the Soviet communist anti-Jewish. Judaism was erased in Soviet countries. So that's an example of that. Now Babi Yar does have acknowledgement of the Jewish death. This is a really complicated question. How do we as Jews deal with Europeans, in which many Europeans were collaborators and active collaborators and very enthusiastic collaborators with the Nazis? Is anybody listening to Rachel Maddow's new podcast, Ultra? It's amazing. Anyway, she talks about these fascists in America in 1940. I mean, part of what I challenge myself, because I am similarly of this generation which grew up this way and very much don't buy a German product, don't drive a German car, don't go to Poland, etc. So what I'm trying to do is learn more and more and more, and that's what I meant about the current scholarship that's coming out of these places. So I'll say this is complicated. Yes, there were, what I want to know is, what am I going to do with that knowledge exactly? So part of what I do with that knowledge is, as people who have heard me talk about this for years, the best response to anti-Semitism is to be more Jewish. That is the best response to fascist anti-Semites who want to kill our people. That is the strongest thing. If I am part of creating a community of Jews, LGBT Jews and everybody, who will outlast me, and when I'm dead, this community will continue, that is my strongest response to the fact that there were Ukrainian fascists who killed Jews with enthusiasm. So that's one piece, is that's how and that I live my life Jewishly, I study Jewish things, I eat Jewish food, whatever it is that is more and more deeply Jewish. Every time I do that, I'm dancing on Hitler's grave, right? That is the old. So then that's a question, okay, what do you do about these grandchildren of Nazi collaborators? collaborators. So first of all, I'm learning a lot about Ukrainian suffering. Why were Ukrainians, in particular, even open to Nazis? So when you start to study this, and this is the contemporary, then there's the Khmelnytsky stuff from the 1600s, which is a whole separate issue. When you start to study how much suffering they experienced by the Soviet regime, they started to, many of them felt like the Nazis were going to be a liberation from the Soviets. We can't even imagine that, because we didn't suffer that way from the Soviets, and Nazis only killed us. If we weren't Jewish, and this is always the question, right? Well, how would you have acted if you were a Pole, a non-Jewish Pole living in Warsaw, and the ghetto was going up, and Jews were being put in the ghetto? What would you have done? What would I have done? I don't mean you, I'm not pointing at you. I mean, what would I have done? Would I have been so righteous, or would I have just kind of kept my face down and tried to protect my family? If I knew if I was caught, everybody in my family would be murdered, what would I actually do? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know with some of these scenarios. So part of what I'm trying to do is to deepen my knowledge of the world that produced fascists. And one of the things that we're learning too easily here in America is that people are very easily manipulated to become monsters. Can you imagine it happening now in America, that mobs start attacking women who have an abortion? I don't think it's so. Or mobs start attacking. We just had a governor of a state of Florida say that a teacher will be fired if they teach anything positive about LGBT. That just happened this week in this country. So what starts to happen? We're going to start to see mobs here. I think part of the issue that I have to confront about myself is the idea that the Ukrainians, the Polish, they were all somehow a different human being that are somehow monsters that I don't have to deal with myself. I don't forgive them. It's not up to me to forgive anybody who was a Nazi collaborator. But I want to get more deeply into it because I want to change it from happening, and I want to make sure I don't ever act that way. But what is it exactly that makes people do things like that? Look around America today. What's about to start happening here? What's already happening here? So I don't know where the line is drawn, and that's what I want to know more about. And it's horrifying, but I'm not like the progressive world, which says don't talk more about the Holocaust. There's a whole part of the progressive world which is we're done talking about the Holocaust. Believe me, I dive deep into it all the time. If I could take a CBST trip to every concentration camp in Europe, I would. We've so far done 2. So I do believe in really, really, really witnessing it. But I want to understand it more and more and more and more. I want to be able to condemn it. But like, for instance, there's this group now, this Ukrainian Jewish Encounter group that's really trying to approach it with honest history. The Ukrainians taking responsibility for what happened and trying to develop a joint effort in that way, and that's inspiring to me.
And even with our hosts, we made sure we had time, bombs permitting, to actually go visit the Jewish Quarter and go visit the memorial to the 150,000 Jews that were exterminated in Lviv between 1941 and 1943. And our hosts knew we were. They actually helped us get guides so we could do the walk in the ghetto in Warsaw and in the Jewish Quarter in Lviv.
I'm going to end, because we're pretty late, so I'm going to end, and I know maybe we'll find other, I want to end with this story. No, we're not going to take another question. I'm just going to end with a story from my last time in the Warsaw ghetto when I was alone and I tried to find that wall, which I showed you that picture. It's not easy to find. It's in a courtyard, and I really wanted to see this remnant of the wall. Some of you might remember I talked about this. And I was walking up and down the street. It's very hard to find, and I don't speak Polish, and obviously. And this old Polish guy comes up to me, and I think, oh my God, here comes a Nazi, and I'm gonna explain to this Polish anti-Semite, that I'm trying to find the wall of the Jewish ghetto, and he's gonna kill me or make fun of me or be hostile to me. And he said to me, he spoke very little English, but he said, wall, like, are you looking for the wall? I said, yeah, I'm trying to find the wall. He said, come with me. I'll show it to you. And he took me, it's very hard to find. And the guide we had said, and I think this was this guy, that there was an old man who was a Pole who believed in he was known, I don't know, to this day I don't know if it's the same person, I like to think it was, who lived right by that wall, who saw it as his life's work to make sure people knew that wall was there. He wasn't Jewish. No, he wasn't Jewish. He believed so deeply in witnessing and remembering what that wall was that he lived right there, and he would keep taking people to the wall, and he kept the wall cared for and cleaned, and he wasn't Jewish. Yeah. Yeah. So let's pray that any of us in similar circumstances act like decent, righteous people and not like the other type, and let's see if we can do that. And we're going to be tried and tested in these years to come. And the question is going to be, who are we? Ayeka, where are we? Anyway, so thank you for hanging in for this late night session. So great to see the sanctuary so filled.